When fighting broke out between the colonists and the British in 1775, it wasn't a sudden event. It was the result of years of mistrust and rising tensions. Everyone, including British leadership in the colonies, realized that the situation was serious, but few realized how close it was to bloodshed. On September 1st, 1774, General Thomas Gage gave orders which nearly led to a battle 7 months before shots first rang out at Lexington and Concord. The nearly forgotten powder alarm is history that deserves to be remembered. By 1774, the political crisis between the colonists and the mother country was solidifying. Following the Boston Tea Party in December 1773, the British Parliament responded with the Intolerable Acts in 1774. The acts, passed from March to June, essentially stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance. It closed the port of Boston until damages had been paid, and the Massachusetts Government Act took away the colony's charter. The next act allowed the Massachusetts governor to move trials against officials to be taken out of the colony if he thought that the official couldn't get a fair trial. Washington called the act the Murder Act and the Quartering Act, which applied to all of the colonies. The Quebec Act was unrelated to the Tea Party, but also infuriated American colonists as it extended the province of Quebec into what is now the American Midwest. The British hoped that the acts were heavy enough to deter further rebellion, but they had seriously miscalculated. The Intolerable Acts turned large numbers of colonists, especially in Massachusetts, away from the Crown, and resistance unified as other colonies sent supplies to Boston. Thomas Gage was already the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, but he was also appointed governor of Massachusetts in April 1774, with instructions to enforce the Intolerable Acts. Gage was worried about the situation. In retrospect, he had misjudged badly when he told the king that they would be lions, while we are lambs. But if we take the resolute part, they will undoubtedly prove very meek. Gage arrived in Boston in May and found the situation difficult. He tried to maintain a level of impartiality, punishing his own troops as well as the colonists, which just made him unpopular with everyone. His own men called him Granny Gage, thinking him too timid. Meanwhile, governing the colonists was proving impossible. One of his first actions was to veto 14 of the 28 councilors proposed by the Massachusetts House of Representatives, but he took it a step further by appointing others using a writ of mandamus for the first time. He had trouble filling government positions due to threats, and the colonists, banned from holding town meetings, invented county conventions. American militia companies were ignoring commands from loyalist commanders and drilling constantly. Most concerning to Gage was the militia's use of gunpowder from provincial powder houses. Powder houses stored gunpowder and weapons across the colonies. More than 200 were built in New England in order to safely store and in emergencies arm local militias. Originally, they were meant to provide supplies for local forces in the face of conflict with Native Americans or other European forces, but they were quickly becoming a focal point of supply for colonial rebels. Nominally under the control of the authorities, the supplies were often practically in the hands of patriots. On July 22nd, a letter from a Boston merchant mentions that Gage had given an order to release less gunpowder from the powder house on the Boston Common, as he delivered near 2,000 barrels in the course of about a fortnight, which gave some alarm to the troops. Gage sent a letter to Major General Brattle in Cambridge, asking for a report as fast as convenient on supplies of military stores there. The Brattle letter would prove important. In his reply on August 27th, Brattle warned that the supplies were at risk of being stolen. He claimed that local military companies had orders to meet at 1 minute's warning, equipped with arms and ammunition. Gage somehow lost this letter, and it was picked up by a patriot and printed in a broadside. That same day, all of the powder stocks belonging to the towns had been removed from the powder house at Charlestown, leaving only 250 half barrels of so-called King's powder, which belonged to the province. On August 31st, Gage finally decided to take action. He ordered the removal of the King's powder from the Charlestown powder house and several province-owned cannons from Cambridge. Gage was within his official rights, but he was aware that the move was going to be inflammatory and hoped to accomplish it quietly and quickly. British troops on the Boston Common began moving that afternoon, and American patriots were on high alert. More information came on the morning of September 1st, when the soldiers began moving. Before dawn that morning, several hundred British troops boarded boats at the Long Wharf in Boston, rowing up the Mystic River to the Ten Hills area in Charlestown. The Charlestown powder house sat on Quarry Hill, about a mile from the river. There they waited for full light before entering, to avoid walking into a powder house with a lighted lantern. They removed 250 half-barrels there and detached a force to Cambridge for the cannons. Before noon, the supplies had been removed to a fort off Boston Harbor called Castle William. The operation was flawless, but eye-opening for the Patriots. They wouldn't be caught so flat-footed again. By the evening, crowds had gathered in Cambridge, cursing Gage. Rumors flew that British soldiers had attacked colonists, that the Royal Navy had bombarded Boston. John Adams, running before the news was clear, told his wife Abigail that every gentleman seems to consider the bombardment of Boston as the bombardment of the capital of his own province. Church bells all over the state rang, and bonfires meant to be a warning were lit. According to Paul Revere's ride by Dave Hackett Fisher, a traveler named McNeil was at a tavern in Shrewsbury that night. He was awakened by a messenger telling the tavern owner that the powder was taken. Within 15 minutes, 50 men had gathered, equipping themselves and setting up posts to the neighboring towns. Traveling to Boston the following morning, McNeil said he never saw such a scene before. All along the road were armed men rushing forward. At every house, women and children were making cartridges, running bullets. They left scarcely half a dozen men in town. Ezra Stiles, a clergyman, estimated that perhaps one-third of the effective men in all New England took arms and were on an actual march for Boston. Another witness claimed 20,000 men marched from the Connecticut Valley alone. Colonel Israel Putnam in Pomfret, Connecticut, was preparing to raise a force to march on Boston. And beyond the Hudson River, Colonel William Johnson gathered numerous Mohawk warriors and was marching on Boston already, though which side he was marching for is not clear. Messengers from Boston were literally intercepting and turning back thousands of armed men. Stiles reported 2,000 from Bennington were turned back and another 2,000 from Berkshire. Early on September 2nd, a crowd of 4,000 people gathered at the Cambridge Common, with men coming from all over the countryside. They were not armed, although their arms lay nearby. Committees of correspondence had acquired the facts in the previous day's movement and quickly sent messages out to head off the rumor mill. Armed with cudgels and sticks, the crowd at Cambridge marched on Tory Row in the city, gathering around William Brattle's home. Brattle fled for his life and published a desperate apology in the papers. "I'm extremely sorry for what has taken place. I hope I may be forgiven." He was not. Brattle never returned home. Next, the crowd converged on Colonel David Phipps, the sheriff who had handed over keys to the powder house. They forced him to swear in writing that he would not enforce the coercive acts and would recall writs from the new establishment. Another Tory Row inhabitant, Thomas Oliver, was forced to resign his seat on Gage's royal council. "My house at Cambridge, surrounded by about 4,000 people, in compliance with their command, I sign my name," he wrote on the resignation. At the mansion of Jonathan Sewell, someone from inside the house fired a pistol. Whig leaders had to physically hold back the crowd as they began smashing windows. Sewell fled. He would leave the country a few months later and never returned. Papers were nailed to the doors of lawyers, threatening them with death if any of them appeared in the new court the coercive acts created. A crowd of mounted patriots caught up with Customs Commissioner Hollowell in his post-chase, a luxury carriage. "Damn you, how do you like us now, you Tory son of a bitch?" one accosted him. Hollowell took a horse and fled, pursued by a reported 160 infuriated Yankees. Whig leaders, who had been stirring up a spirit of resistance, were suddenly on the other foot, desperately trying to prevent the alarm becoming a battle. Despite ongoing rumors that troops were on the move, Gage kept his men on a tight rein. Despite tens of thousands of people taking up arms, the event also proved that the Americans could have some discipline. As the Boston Gazette reported, despite reports that British troops were being mobilized, when dispatches soon returning and assuring the body that the soldiers still remained, they set about their goals without bloodshed, though they were more than prepared. It seemed to put up a fight, if it came to it. The Boston Post added that the alarm brought large bodies with their arms, provisions, and ammunition, determined by some means to give check to a power which so openly threatened their destruction, and in such a clandestine manner robbed them of the means of their defense. Stiles summarized that the event proved that New Englanders are ready to fight for their liberties. Paul Revere wrote that the spirit of liberty never was higher than at present. A few days later, over 4,000 patriots in Worcester forced the court officials there to resign, effectively shuttering the royal court there in what's called the Worcester Revolt. Patriots had already forced similar resignations in both Berkshire and Hampshire counties. The event had a profound effect on General Gage. He canceled a planned operation to seize power from Worcester. His reports to England were pessimistic. On September 2nd, he wrote that he found the situation much worse than I expected when I arrived here. Civil government is near its end. He advised that a very respectable force should take the field, and that conciliating, moderation, reasoning is over. Nothing can be done but by forcible means. 10 days later, he wrote that nothing less than the conquest of almost all the New England provinces will procure obedience. He had learned that all of the colonies were inflamed, including New York, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas. He begged for reinforcements. If you think 10,000 sufficient, send 20. If 1,000,000 is thought enough, give 2. The alarm had made it clear to Gage that war was inevitable. In November, he even suggested that the coercive acts be suspended until reinforcements could be sent. The Patriots, meanwhile, immediately began collecting as much gunpowder as possible. Nearly all of it was imported, and any war against the British would require an enormous amount of it. Israel Putnam, after the alarm had been quelled, advised Massachusetts to keep a strict guard over the remainder of your powder, for that must be the great means, under God, of the salvation of our country. In October, Great Britain banned the export of arms and ammunition from Great Britain. The Patriots improved their ability to respond to such events as well. It was clear that initial conflict, if it occurred, would be centered on Boston, and so according to Alan French in The Siege of Boston, the Patriots made plans about where militia would rally, possibly Worcester, but more likely Concord, on the road towards the city. More vital was how to inform the militia, and a system was put together to quickly relay messages. Paul Revere, who did not ride during the alarm but who coordinated messengers, was one of the men at the center of the system. He recalled that he recruited upwards of 30, chiefly mechanics, who formed ourselves into a committee for the purpose of watching the movements of British soldiers. On September 21st, a group of patriots gathered at Worcester, recommending reorganizations to the local militia, dividing the county into 7 regiments and suggesting that they enlist 1/3 of the men of their respective towns, between 16 and 60 years of age, to be ready to act at a minute's warning. In October, the outlawed Massachusetts legislature declared itself the First Provincial Congress. The powder alarm on September 2nd proved to be just the first in an escalating series of confrontations that led inevitably to bloodshed at Lexington and Concord. On December 12th, Revere got intelligence that Gage was going to send men to Fort William and Mary at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to seize stores there. Revere rode there the next day, and Patriots raided the fort on December 14th. Gage, however, had only considered the action and never ordered it. Powder from forts in Newport and Providence, Rhode Island, and New London, Connecticut were also carried off by the militia. In February of 1775, British regulars were sent to Salem to confiscate weapons and were stopped by a crowd, which delayed them long enough that the weapons could be moved. All of these events led directly to preparedness for what was to come. In February, Parliament declared that Massachusetts was in a state of rebellion. In April, Gage, still with limited forces, was ordered to disarm the rebels and arrest their leaders. On April 18th, Gage sent orders that the British regulars were to march to Concord and destroy the rebel supplies held at the powder house there. Already warned by British behavior, militia at Lexington were assembling even before word came from Boston that the British were moving. Revere, along with William Dawes and others, sent the alarm, and the following day the first shots were fired in the American Revolution. Gage had simply miscalculated. He had imagined that the Americans would cower in the face of the British military, and instead he had watched a force that was around 10 times the size of the force that he commanded materialize out of nearly thin air. By 1774, Gage had become convinced that open warfare was almost certain. The Americans only became more determined and more organized thereafter. Some historians like Mary Beth Norton, Robert J. Allison, and Ray Raphael have even argued that 1774 was the year the revolution started, the year that mere resistance turned into open rebellion, months before the shot heard round the world. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.